it looks like we'll conclude chapter 4 of part 6. The Father of all made man to be wedded. And let us remember that this Father of all is genderless and wifeless. The oldest history of creation says God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Genesis 1:27. Now let us remember that that word means the same thing as when a person looks at their reflection. It doesn't mean that we look like God, because there are words and phrases for that. It means that we're reflections of God's power. It is observable that it does not say that God created them, a man and a woman, but masculine and feminine, after the image of God, who is at once both masculine and feminine. Well, more like neither. But of course, this is being put in the Christian context of limiting divinity into forms. It requires the union of the masculine and the feminine to make oneness in humanity as it does in divinity. Well, we know in this world now there are creatures that don't require gender. God would be only a half God and therefore no God if he were either masculine only or feminine only. Well, not quite. But certainly there are superiorities and inferiorities when you compare the male and the female to each other, both in physical and mental terms. There is no completeness in any man or woman. No, they are sort of complete in themselves. It doesn't mean that they don't work together with others or they don't, get married or whatever. The two are required to make one. The tie between husband and wife are closer than that between parent and child. In the beginning, there was a single pair, the devotion of the one to the other, the absolute necessity of each to the other for personal relief and comfort and for the propagation of the race, and the indissolubleness of the union thus contracted was demonstrated by their very position in the universe. They could never part. Whichever did anything that made any separation between them committed a wrong. That represents the normal condition of the state of wedlock. Now, in the Quran, I think the first incident of a way that happens that's mentioned is referring to people who do the evil magic. But of course, the usual ones of treatment and people cheating and stuff like that, that's also, mentioned thoroughly enough. In whatever scripture. Well, the Bible's not as complete in its way of avoiding major sins, but it is enough for pretty much anybody. When men and women multiplied, there arose a multiplication of possibilities of violating the original law. The most that Moses seemed to do was to put in form certain arrangements for regulating, as far as possible, the irregularities which had sprung up in society. Hard-hearted men would put their wives away. Moses interposed in behalf of the women. Or was it one woman in the story, but it would have been an example for all the women. Jesus goes back to the first principles and thence deduces the law of divorce. One, the married pair are one in flesh and heart and life, and neither should do anything which shall weaken or soil this blessed union. 2. No man shall divorce his wife unless he know her to have first violated the law of chastity, otherwise he wrongs her and drives her to do wrong. Well, you can't blame the wrong of one person on another in that case, but if to that unlawful putting away he superadd the marrying of another woman, he commits adultery with that second woman. Now, that's something new claimed, but the statement in Mark, who is as remarkable for his attention to details as he is for his lack of attention to chronological order, is, whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. The original Greek is ep, autah, and this, I believe, refers to the second wife, and the classical usage of this preposition with the accusative, I think, justifies my interpretation. Of course, at the same time, he is an adulterer, quad his former wife. Now, why doesn't he just stay with the other wife? Because in the Jesus section of the Bible, there is no ban on polygamy, and it appears that Jesus may have been polygamous, as we have formerly went over related to this book. For the woman who is separated from her husband for her own fault is an adulteress afresh if she marry again. A form of marriage cannot annul the wrong of the transaction. 5. If the husband be innocent and the wife guilty, a divorce may ensue. The husband may marry, but the wife may not. A second marriage would be a continuance of her sin. These 5 particulars seem to reside in the original law of marriage as stated by Jesus. And, well, that's far from the original law of marriage, but, for example, in the Islamic vision, the only marriage that's a sin is the unlawful marriage. And it's not saying that in an unlawful marriage that the fornication is continued, you could say. If you marry somebody the opposite gender and they're a polytheist or something like that, it can be a sin, but it's not saying that the marriage itself is a sin. It's not saying that the marriage that the person's a fornicator should be punished for fornication or something like that. And of course, the males can marry the people of the book and that sort of stuff. But just trading one wife for another, that's also condemned in Islam. One doesn't divorce just to go marry someone else or something like that. Dr. Woolsey, Essay on Divorce, page 59, sums up the teaching very clearly in the following sentence. The general principle serving the groundwork of all these declarations is that legal divorce does not, in the view of God, and according to the correct rule of morals, authorize either husband or wife thus separate to marry again, with the single exception that when the divorce occurs on account of a sexual crime, the innocent party may, without guilt, contract a second marriage. Well, duh. But there's other things too. There's physical abuse, there's menial cruelty. Whether these views of Jesus were fundamentally right, we are not now to discuss. This is what he taught. This teaching has, through ages, controlled the opinions of the best minds, controlled the opinions of those who call themselves Christian, and thoroughly changed domestic life from what we know it to have been in Greece and Rome and Palestine in the times of Jesus to what we know it is in the best parts of America and Europe today. Well, it was called Israel, but the Romans changed its name to Palestine to insult the Jews. Palestine being an ancient slur that the Jews came up with. Oh, you're wallowers for the she-demon, There were Satanists about, but not to that extent. Come on. It is noticeable that Wherever these views have prevailed, there has been a better state of society in every other particular, and that departure from the principles has marked social decay. All legislation not conformed to these principles having the effect of rapidly damaging the moral tone of society. No society is good in that it is that in which a divorced man, unless he be parted from his wife for reasons of not implying immorality on his part, is held as an acknowledged adulterer, and in which a divorced woman, unless she be parted from her husband by reason of his incontinence, is treated as an unfortunate woman. That Jesus said to his disciples, on the objection which they started and the influence which they made, that marriage was unprofitable, it must be admitted, is a passage of difficulty. Marriage is the normal condition of man, that we know. It is always honorable. Even bad people, it's better that the bad people marry each other, right? No celibacy is equal to chastity in marriage, but there may be celibates. Well, chastity is not the same thing as celibacy. Jesus speaks of three kinds: those who are such by nature, by compulsion, and by choice. One, some have congenital disqualifications. They are born with physical defects which make it impracticable for them to marry. There are those who have been mutilated by men, and this was a large class in the days of Jesus. Well, people who battled sometimes got injured. In our day, the servants who guard the harems in the East are eunuchs. Well, Islam doesn't call for eunuchs, but people for that job even do that, and certain people who violate the rights of slaves would do that. And the Roman Church, it is said, makes eunuchs for the benefit of sacred art, those who sing the Miserere at the Sistine Chapel at Rome, retaining the peculiar characteristics of their voices at the expense of their manhood. Well, they could be better trained, right? You don't have to. In the class of forced celibates also may be reckoned those whom society, the artificial rules of conventional life, exclude from such a union as nature demands and God sanctions, those who decline marriage for the sake of the kingdom of the heavens, a phrase by which Jesus always seems to have set forth his work in the world, because he believed that his work was founded on the principles which maintain the harmonies of the universe, and that his work promulgated and expanded those principles. For the sake of promoting this great work, if he can remain chaste in some exceptional circumstances, a man may remain in celibacy. Otherwise, marriage is better. No man dare be a celibate for his own case and convenience. The rule is that it is better to marry. It must be a mournful exception which justifies a man to abstain. Such an exception occurred, perhaps, in the case of Paul. Such a celibate was Jesus. Again, there's reason against that. It would have been probably pointed out in the narratives that we have in the Bible. But I think one of the things we're crossing over is acting like the teachings of Paul or the teachings of Jesus. But one doesn't avoid sin by being a eunuch, is the Islamic saying. And everybody's supposed to marry in that tradition, so that's, one of the criticisms Islam faces, which but of course, in this case, Jesus spoke figuratively. History gives us a horrible instance of these words having been taken literally. Origen, in the mistaken excess of his ardent youthful zeal for the cause of Jesus, so mutilated himself that he was disqualified for marriage. This act was properly condemned by the ancient church, and for it he was excommunicated from the Church of Alexandria. On the whole subject of marriage and celibacy in the New Testament, compare Schaff's History of the Apostolic Church, 112, page 448 to 454. The liberal rule of Jesus comes out at the close of the interview. You are not to adopt celibacy as a rule. You are not to teach it as a doctrine. You are not to enforce it on others. Let him receive it who is able to receive it, but let him be sure he is able. You cannot be sure in respect of another, therefore you must not lay so grievous and unnatural a burden on another. And same would go for circumcision, right? And why are we turning against nature? Can't we make sacred use of nature?